Today on the In All Kinds of Weather forecast, Neil Blackmon of Saturday Down South and the Florida Basketball Hour podcast joins us to talk about Todd Golden's transformation of the Gator Hoops program from a one-and-done NIT team into a team that you do not want to face in the NCAA tournament. We will also preview the Gators' potential first weekend NCAA tournament opponents. We'll talk about how the injury of Micah Henlogton affects the Gators against those various opponents, and what Florida has to do to make it to the Sweet 16 next weekend. This is the In All Kinds of Weather forecast. Welcome back to the In All Kinds of Weather forecast. I am your host, Neil Schulman. You can follow me on Twitter at All Kinds Weather and on Instagram at All Kinds Weather Blog. Also follow the show on Twitter at IAKOW Forecast. We are starting to be more active on YouTube. As you may have noticed, more shows are coming rapid fire. So if you haven't already done so, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and be sure to comment your thoughts on what we're discussing today below. And today we've got Neil W. Blackmon of Florida Basketball Hour joining us on the In All Kinds of Weather forecast. The other Neil, as I know him, of course, he probably knows me as the other Neil. But anyway, a fantastic breakdown show of Florida Gator basketball that he does with Eric Fawcett. Also writes for Florida Down South about Gator basketball and Gator football, and I think occasionally Gator baseball too. And way back when he wrote for In All Kinds of Weather here and there, when I was just first starting out and needed help, wrote a couple columns for us too. So my fellow Neil, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate being here.
Of course, man. Of course. Always glad to get back with you. Neil is a lawyer in real life, so he's juggling two responsibilities at once, and that may be how and why he's able to form such compelling arguments about different things Gator related. So most of our conversation today going to be focused on the upcoming weekend for Gator basketball, potential opponents in the NCAA tournament. But first, just to set the stage for our listeners, I think everyone watching this knows or agrees that Todd Golden is doing a good job, if not a great job, for Florida. And when he was hired, the thing that I was most impressed by was his super laser-focused analytical approach to everything. Like, for example, he counts missed defensive rotations in practice. Florida's having a practice session. You're on defense. You don't rotate. That's a ding against you. You accumulate enough of those and you don't play. So stuff like that has always appealed to me. And you, Neil Blackmon, recently wrote an excellent piece on what Todd Golden called his meritocracy on Saturday Down South. But yeah, and everyone go read that, by the way, when we're done. But we can throw out words like analytics and meritocracy, and every coach can come up with their catchphrases all they want. Like Willie Taggart, for example, had lethal simplicity. Sounded great until it wasn't. Dan Mullen made the thumb wrestling analogy that everyone loves. So there's a difference between coming up with these catchy words and slogans and then putting them into action and winning games with them. So first question is, how do you think Todd Golden has been able to translate these fun principles into results?
Well, I think a couple things. I think the players, I think players are responsive to coaches to give them freedom. So, for example, Tyrese Samuel is a great guy to kind of analyze in that regard, right? Because he is a guy who, if he faces up the basket, he's expected and given the freedom to attack. He's not just a guy who has to play with his back to the basket. Todd will even let him shoot threes because he does that at about a 30% clip. But if he misses the first one, it's like, no, you're good. You don't get any more of those opportunities today. So it's like when you see a player take an open three like Tyrese Samuel, our response at home oftentimes is no. Why are you taking that shot? But when you coach someone like that and you give him the freedom to do that sort of thing, and you figure if he makes 30% of them, then it's still a relatively efficient risk to take. So I think that's something that translates with players. They like the freedom because it shows that the coach has confidence in them and their abilities. So I think that's part of it. I also think the biggest thing right now in the portal era, in the NIL era, is your ability to construct a roster. And I think when you talk about using analytics to find players that complement one another, and then using the actual process of those players visiting to determine whether they're cultural fits that will be able to play when practices are, based on when there's consequences to miss rotations, when practice really matters, when a coach says practice matters and it actually does matter. So I think all of those things go into roster construction, your cultural fit, but also your basketball fit, because, you look at the success somebody like Nate Oates is having at Alabama, right? He's a guy that understands that certain shots are lower percentage shots. And if over a course of a 70 possession game, his team takes the most high percentage shots, more often than not, that's going to work out for them. And I think Golden's approach to that is similar, and his approach to roster building is to build a team that best complements each other to take the best shots for 70 possessions over the course of a game and then over a course of a season. So it's a good way to build a roster. He's very, very process oriented. You don't hear him talk about it being the process a lot. That kind of Nick Saban cliche that's become so pervasive in sports, but that is certainly what Golden and this staff are. They're very process oriented, and that's how they've made evaluations with freshmen like Alex Connon and Thomas Houck, who've also contributed, right? Is that they trust the process they have to make those evaluations. It's not just turning on film. I promise you that. There's a lot more that goes into that. And so when they are told that they had the 14th ranked freshman class in the SEC, and they kind of grinned at those press conferences, we now know why.
I think we do know why. It's pretty clear to see how a couple of 3-stars like Thomas Houck and Alex Condon from Pennsylvania and Australia are now rebounding over these big 4 or 5-stars from Kentucky and Tennessee. Definitely a nice pair of evals there. So let's talk about what lies ahead for Florida now for the rest of the show. I think, in fact, I'm sure that you've talked about this on your own show, but what were your thoughts first on Florida seed as a 7, and then your thoughts on the Gators draw, especially focusing on this first weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I think Florida seed was not particularly supportable. It was a disappointing seed. I wasn't, on the outrage scale. I'm not going to stand up and yell and say it was the worst or most egregious mistake the committee's ever made, or even the worst mistake they made this year. I don't think it was. I thought there's at least one Mountain West team that should not be anywhere near where they were seated, and probably 2 or 3. So I think those are all more egregious mistakes than Florida. I think Virginia getting in is indefensible. And I think Gonzaga getting a 5 seed is relatively indefensible. So I would put Florida somewhere down beyond those in terms of bad choices. But I will point out this: Bracket Matrix is a website that aggregates all the bracketologists out there, then ranks them on their accuracy, and it gives everybody a composite seed. Florida's the only team in the Power 6, including the Big East. You got your traditional Power 5 in the Big East. They're the only team in the Power 6 that was more than 1 seed line worse than their predicted seed. Florida's predicted seed was 5.6, or like a high 6 seed. So to get a 7 didn't make a ton of sense. It also didn't make a ton of sense given some of the people ahead of them. The 2 most egregious examples, I mentioned Gonzaga already. Florida had more quad 1 victories than Gonzaga. They had a better strength of record than Gonzaga. So I think, them getting a 5 made 0 sense. And then Clemson. And Clemson had some impressive victories. You could argue that Clemson had better wins than Florida overall, because they won in Chapel Hill and they won at Alabama. But I think at the end of the day, Florida just didn't have nearly as many egregious losses as Clemson did. And so for Clemson to get a 6 over Florida is not really something that I think anyone can defend. So Florida should have been a 6 seed. They're not. Now, that being said, the second part of your question, the draw that they did get, there are consequences to being a 7 seed. And unfortunately, those consequences here are particularly poor. They're poor because not because Colorado is as good or as trendy as everyone thinks. I think Colorado's talent is enticing to a lot of college basketball analysts. They can really score. They have KJ Simpson, who's probably going to be in the G League at a minimum. He can really shoot. That's one of the best shooters in college basketball. And then they have NBA talent and an all Pac-12, two-time all Pac-12 selection in Tristan Da Silva, who's a matchup problem for Florida because he's kind of that big, long wing that the Gators have struggled with all year. But at the end of the day, Colorado struggles to guard, and teams that struggle to guard have had problems against Florida. I think that's the more favorable matchup. I would say that Boise State, who I think was underseeded worse than Florida and should not be. I mean, the fact they're in the first four is really eye-opening, considering they had 4 quad 1A wins, not just 4 quad 1 wins. And that's more than Auburn had quad 1 wins total, for example. I'm not saying Boise should have gotten a 4, but I am saying there's no way that they were a first 4 team. They aren't terribly athletic, which I think can be something that Florida certainly exploits, but they really guard you and they have good size. So that makes up for the athleticism because everybody they start is 6'4" to 6'8". So, I think that makes them real switchable. Florida's had some issues sometimes when teams can just switch all their ball screens because Florida's so reliant on their ball screens. They'll challenge Florida shooters to shoot over them. And then without Micah Handlockton, Boise State's an excellent rebounding team. So Florida will be down one really quality rebounder. And, obviously Alex Condon and Tommy Houck can rebound, but it's different to ask them to do it 30 minutes a game than it was with that rotation where you can just send waves of bigs out there. So I think that's kind of where those first round matchups are. Maybe I'm wrong and Colorado is a worse matchup because they're just as talented, if not more talented than Florida. But I don't think so. I think Boise is better. I also think Boise is likely to make it a more low variance game. And what I mean by that is that they are really good at controlling tempo and the game will probably be slower. And so in a slower game, Florida's offensive firepower matters a little less because there's less possessions, right? So I think Boise, they're 12th in defensive rebounding percentage. It means they get their misses. Florida's missing one of the best offensive rebounders in the country, means they'll get less of their misses. Could be a tough one for the Gators. Very, very tough matchup for a team that minimizes or limits second chance points. And then also, like, Colorado's really turnover prone. Florida doesn't force a lot of turnovers, but Colorado kind of can be careless with the basketball. Anyway, they don't necessarily need pressure to be bad with the ball. Boise's the opposite. I mean, Max Rice does not turn the ball over, period. He's their senior point guard, so Boise's not going to beat itself, and they're going to guard and rebound. So I think that's a difficult matchup. If Florida were to win, I don't want to discount Marquette. Obviously, they were beat early in the tournament last year. Historically, we all know that usually you bounce back the year after if you return a bunch of guys. So I think there's a good chance that Marquette does bounce back. But I also think that Tyler Kolek, who's probably the best point guard in the country, is not going to be 100%. Even if he plays, he's got an oblique injury. It's hard to think of a sport where an oblique injury, maybe tennis, where an oblique injury matters more than basketball. And, it's not, anybody that's ever had one knows it's not something that just goes away. So it's going to aggravate him. It's going to bother him. Osei Ighodaro is going to be a guy who, again, is a mismatch problem for Florida. I think he will score. But, if Florida could contain Cam Jones, who's kind of like their less good version of Walter Clayton Jr., I think it's a good matchup for the Gators, especially because there's not really another point guard on Marquette's roster. They really were heavily reliant on Tyler Kolek. They've had to do that kind of by committee since he's been out. And even when he's played before the injury, it seemed like it was hurting, and he wasn't terribly effective in his last couple of games before the injury either. So again, The other thing is that they had a guy named Sean Jones, who I think was their best defender, and they lost him with an ACL injury in mid-January. So they're not quite as good at guarding as they were the first 2 months of the year when it looked like they might be a number one seed. I'm not saying that Florida will win that game, but I think it's a better matchup objectively than Boise State, and arguably a better matchup than Colorado if Tyler Kolek is hurt.
Well, Iguodaro has an injury too, right? I mean, he's got a knee injury, so he won't be 100% either. So, getting a little
Right.
ahead of ourselves though.
Good
So,
point.
I mean, being a lawyer, of course, you answered a bunch of questions at once, which I like. I mean, yeah, you pretty much answered the question I had about how much the injury of Micah Hanlogton is going to hurt Florida. Obviously, it's not the end of the world because Florida does have Alex Condon and they do have Thomas Houck and they do have Tyree Samuel, but it's also not ideal for sure. So somewhere in between that, not the end of the world, or yeah, somewhere in between that end of the world and no big deal at all, I think is probably the answer. The question is going to be where on that matrix it falls, depending on the opponents. And that's where I want to start talking about the Gators' first round opponents, potential first round opponents. I seem to be the only Gator that I know of, a fan, media member, a content creator, blogger, whatever you want to call us. I seem to be the only Gator that would rather have Boise State than Colorado because yes, Boise State has size, but they can't score, especially against good teams. They just cannot score. And Colorado shoots 39.4% from three. And that terrifies me because if they get hot from outside, like I remember that LSU game where they hit 11 threes, and that game got way more frightening than it should have. So I can't help but feel like Florida would be, I don't want to say I don't want to say Boise State would be a good matchup for Florida, but I feel like Florida could at least hold their own against Boise State because they haven't really done it against a team that has a Tyree Samuel who's 6'10 and 240 and an Alex Condon who's 6'11 and a Thomas Houck. So talk to me about that. I mean, obviously they have the size and obviously they rebound, but is it going to be that big a problem for Florida against Boise State?
So here's where I would push back a little on their scoring issues. I think you're right that they are not as good offensively as say like they were the best offense in terms of points per game in Mountain West play. But like if you peel back that layer a bit, a lot of those were like beatdowns of the bad teams in that conference. And then when they played good teams, they'd score in the 60s pretty consistently. So I think that's a good point that like against good competition, it's been harder for them to score on the offensive end. I do think that the main thing that they'd really do is something that hurts Florida, even in a world where Micah Hanlockton plays, and that's that they prevent offensive rebounds. Now, the question I think becomes, can Florida keep them off the offensive glass? Because what happens when you have trouble scoring, right? You need to get your own misses. I mean, that's part of the reason that Todd built this roster the way he did was you can elevate your efficiency by 20 to 30 spots in KenPom and win more games if you get points off offensive rebounds when your offense breaks down. And I think Florida did that for much of the season. And I think Leon Rice's Boise State team is really, really good at that. And they're really good at it against anybody. Now, you pointed out, I think the important thing is, can Florida keep them from scoring? And I think, and can they score against Florida? Colorado's going to score against Florida. Now, that said, Alabama scored against Florida too. And so did Texas A&M. And so have plenty of teams that can really score the ball. But in terms of Boise State, I think for me, it's just Florida is going to have some issues on the glass doing what they do best, which is get on the glass and get scores. And they've had trouble against teams that are real switchable and that guard at a high level because they're real switchable, which is kind of Boise State's profile. That's the only reason that it scares me a little more. I just look at historically where Florida's been this year against teams that don't guard great. And usually they've been in the win column.
I mean, that's fair. That's definitely a fair take. I do want to throw one stat out there. Boise State has played 14 games against NCAA tournament teams this year. In 10 of them, they did not hit 70 points. And in two of the four
Yeah,
that they
it's good
did,
stats.
they had to go to overtime. So I think that that's worth noting. Now, Florida's not going to put up a big number against them, but I still think that even in the game with fewer possessions, Boise State's inability to score, even if they do get some of their own rebounds, I feel like Florida is going to get some other ones. And I see that doesn't scare me as much as Colorado, because that 39.4% from three is something that terrifies me. So they don't have size like Florida. They don't defend like Florida does. But Colorado, as you mentioned, does have some star power. They have a couple of guys that I think are going to be in the NBA one day. Florida, I don't know if you're going to say the Gators have as much pure star power as they do. I mean, KJ Simpson's a guy that scares me. Tristan Da Silva is a guy that certainly has talent. Colorado also doesn't have a lot of wins against good teams this year, but I feel like one that is or two wins that are worth pointing out are against Kyle Smith and Washington State, who plays a very similar style of ball as Todd Golden. In fact, Kyle Smith was a mentor of Todd Golden. So what do you think of that potential matchup? Should Florida and Colorado match up in the first round?
Yeah, I think it'd be a really fun NCAA tournament game. And obviously as Florida people, there's a rooting interest. So it makes those things less fun. But to a neutral, it's probably a really entertaining game. I'm sure that in anticipation of possibly getting it had something to do with Florida getting a CBS slot with the best crew that they have, Kevin Harlan and all those dudes. Um, Cody Williams is kind of the X factor for them. He's guy should probably be a lottery pick, whether he decides to stay. I think if he leaves and is gone after this year, he would probably fall towards the back end of the first round, but could go higher depending on his workouts. And he's had games this year where he's really good. He's also battled some injuries and has not played great down the stretch. But he's 6'8". He can shoot it. He can drive. I think he's a guy who would give Florida some matchup problems, especially because Florida's going to have to help on Tristan Da Silva, who is, as I mentioned, a two-time All Pac-12 player, and I think as good a forward as there is in the Pac-12. Now, KJ Simpson, again, is a tremendous shooter. You mentioned it. He's a big reason that they shoot as well as they do. But Tristan Da Silva is a stretch four, so he's a guy that can make them on the pick and pop. And even though he's not terribly fast and can sometimes struggle in defense against smaller players, he's offensively brilliant. Eddie Lampkin Jr. Is their big man. He is a good offensive rebounder and a poor defensive rebounder, much like most guys that are his size. And so Florida, will have to help. And guards are going to have to dig down to get rebounds against them. But again, I still think they are not a good defensive basketball team. They haven't beaten a team ranked higher than 42nd in KenPom all year. Those two wins are against Washington State, who plays a similar style, but they have not shown the propensity to beat good opponents. Even down the year when late in the year when they've gotten hot, they did it in a 3-bid Pac-12, and they're the third bid who was in the first four. So, I appreciate a story where somebody is 16-9, 7-7, and not even in consideration for a tournament bid, and then they make a run and get in. But the reality is Florida's played just as well as Colorado down the stretch. And Florida has really feasted on teams that can't turn you over and that don't really have rim protectors. So as long as you mentioned the X factor in that game, the other X factor in that game, in addition to Cody Williams and his performance, would be 3-point defense. As long as KJ Simpson doesn't light the Gators up, Florida advances.
Fair enough. I mean, I think the X factor for most games in the NCAA tournament is rebounding. And if someone shoots 55% from three. But a couple of stats,
Right.
Yeah, well, exactly. So, a couple of stats I do wanted to point out. Florida obviously is bigger than Colorado. There's no debate there. Just wanted to go put out a couple of numbers for Florida and Boise State, that potential matchup. So, they're big guys. Boise State's Omar Stanley, 6'8" and 240, and fellow big man Tyson Degenhart is 6'8" and 235. Big, not as big as Tyree Samuel, who's 6'10, 240, and who has skill. Obviously, those guys have skill too, but Tyree Samuel has honed his skills against Kentucky, against Auburn, against Alabama, against Tennessee. And Alex Condon, who's taller than all of them, is 6'11. Now, yes, there will be technical pieces to this. You're going to have to box out. You're going to have to establish the inside leverage there. But from a numbers perspective, it's not like Boise State is going to dominate Florida, or at least they should not. So now let's move on to the round of 32. Last question about our potential. You know what? I hate to do this because we did this a couple of years ago, and it wound up not being Ohio State, wound up being a 15 seed that advanced. So is there anything about Western Kentucky that makes you think that they can pull the first round upset and be the next round opponent?
Well, I mean, again, Tyler Kolek's health is an interesting thing to kind of pay attention to because he's so far and away the best player on Marquette. And the thing that would make me not pick Western Kentucky, interestingly, is probably the thing that makes them the hardest to play against, and that's that they play so fast. And they're extremely well coached. Steve Lutz is a star in the industry, a young star. It's his third NCAA tournament appearance in 3 years. He went to two at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. Just took the Western Kentucky job. They were picked to finish 8th in Conference USA, and they won the league. So he is obviously somebody that knows what he's doing. But I think traditionally, like teams that play super fast, the problem with that in the NCAA tournament, especially at the mid-major level, is you play high possession games against teams with way more talent than you. And that's exactly what would happen here. And like it's sort of, eventually it just works itself out. It's like if you have 3 or 4 good defensive linemen, but you don't have 6 or 7 in the SEC, like you cannot hide from that deficiency for 4 quarters. And, it's tough to hide from not having as much talent in a 75 possession game. It's much easier in a 64 possession game if, to your point, you rebound and shoot the 3.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why I did. I I can't believe I did this. I didn't actually call the upset a couple years ago of Oral Roberts beating Ohio State, but I did say if there ever is going to be a 15 over 2, watch out for Max Asmus. Watch out for Kevin O'Banner. Those are NBA guys on that team. So Ohio State might have their hands full. I didn't pick that upset, but I was close to it. So anyway, we know that 15s over 2s can happen. Florida's had to face 2 of them now. They faced Norfolk State a few years ago too. Actually, more than a decade ago now. Time flies. Wow. And so it's not completely out of the question, but I think that we can agree that the most likely opponent is going to be Marquette. You have talked about the health of Tyler Kolek, also mentioned the health of Oso Ighodaro, banged his knee. So let's say that the 2 of those guys do play, but they're both at 60% health. Or let's say Kolek is 60% health. Let's say Ighodaro is at 80% health. Florida, obviously, with 0 of Micah Hanlockton. So with that injury situation being what it is for both teams, talk to me about that matchup. What do you think happens, and what kind of game do you think we see?
Well, it's one where I think if Florida protects the ball, they have a really good chance to win. And that's Florida's been that way. With Florida, it's been that way all year, where if they have high turnover numbers, they're less likely to win. There are some people who think that turnover rate is a little bit overrated if you play fast, and I think that there's some truth to that. It's just math. But against Marquette, that's what they do. That's how they guard you, right? They're not a team. Now, Oso Ighodaro has great length, great size. He's effective at tipping passes and the passing lanes. He's a pretty good shot blocker. I wouldn't call him an elite shot blocker, but a pretty good one. A lot of his shot blocks, though, come in transition, sort of like some of Alex Condon's do, where if you think you have a layup and then boom, Oso Ighodaro is there and help. He's not an under the basket rim protector. Obviously, Tyler Kolek is a guy that can get a lot of steals. They have a guy off the bench that they play quite a bit named Chase Ross, who is pretty good at getting steals. And I think they're 20th in the country at steal rate. So they will turn you over. What they don't necessarily do awesome is guard the 3-point line. That's a problem against Florida. And what they also sometimes, don't do awesome is slow you down. They will let opponents play fast. And I think that feeds into kind of what Florida wants to do. So in that regard, there are other things other than the health of Tyler Kolek that make the matchup, I think, pretty favorable for Florida. I got a text message from the beat writer at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel from who covers Marquette basketball. And he said, if Florida plays Marquette, Marquette will lose by 15 points. And I texted back and said, wow, really? I said, we don't beat anybody by 15 points. And he said, well, that's fair. He goes, let's make it 8-10. And I said, yeah, that sounds about right.
Fair enough. You did not go for the low-hanging fruit of their rebounding issues, which exist even with Osa Ighodaro, who is their leading rebounder. But I think it's worth pointing out just how bad Marquette is at rebounding. Marquette is -2 in the rebounding margin. How is that even possible for an NCAA tournament team, let alone a 1 or 2 seed, to be -2 in the rebounding delta per game and be as good as they are? They obviously do other things very well, but that's something that I think even without Micah Handlogten, Florida should be able to win the game just based on that, no?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one where it would really help to have one of the 3 best offensive rebounders in the country, and he would have been the second best in the field because Sam Godwin from Oklahoma was left out, so that apparently Tony Bennett in Virginia could play, I guess. But yeah, I mean, Florida should be able to control the glass. There's no question about that. I will say that for all their rebounding woes, they were at least at a minimum, they were good at preventing offensive rebounds in Big East play. They were 5th in the Big East at that, and had a positive rebounding margin in Big East play. But, again, that's a 3-bid league, much to their chagrin. We've all heard them complain about that. And it was so that -2 is really interesting when you think about it, because that came in their really tough non-conference. I mean, hats off to Shaka for all the teams they played. They played Illinois, they played Kansas, they played Purdue, they played Wisconsin, they played Texas, they played Notre Dame. They didn't care. Like, they went out there and challenged themselves. They lost some of those games. They won some of those games. They did not rebound in any of those games.
No, that's just the pattern for them. But I still, regardless of the level of competition, I find it flabbergasting to see that they were 301 in the country out of 351 Division I NCAA basketball teams in the rebounding margin. Like, there's being bad, there's being like outside the top 100, there's being outside the top 300 in that statistic. So that's a game where, I mean, you're the one who talks basketball for a living. I'm just a guy that talks all sports, but I kind of feel like that matters in a sense that even if Florida doesn't have Micah Handlogten, the Gators should control the boards. But let's move on now talking about the Gators themselves, because we talked about Florida's opponents, but let's talk about what Florida does and what they don't do and how that could impact their road forward potentially. So obviously Florida has a very good rebounding front court. We know that they don't have one of the members of it, but we still know that they're going to more or less be okay there because of the depth that they have there. What we don't necessarily know is how Florida is going to be able to score from the free throw line, something that is concerning as they've had these sort of peaks and troughs throughout the course of the year. They started off pretty weak in that area, seemed to have gotten better throughout the course of the year, but then in the SEC tournament, it wasn't always so pretty. So is that something that concerns you? And if it is, how do we fix that? Because this is where it matters.
Yeah, I'm not sure it can be fixed. I think the roster is kind of what the roster is. Look, they were really good at the line in 3 of their 4 SEC tournament games. And if you don't want to say 3, at least say 2, and then say they were pretty good against Auburn, where they hit 72%. Obviously, the 3 misses from Zion Pullen were really uncharacteristic. But it was his 4th game in 4 days. And when you're tired, you either overcompensate by missing back rim long, or you miss short rim. And his 3 were both. So they were fatigue misses, and looked like that. So none of these teams that Florida is playing in either the first or second round are terribly heavy analytics staff. I've never seen a game where Leon Rice, hacked somebody when they were in the 1-1, where Marquette or Shaka hacked somebody because they were in the 1-1. It's certainly something that Alabama did. We saw them do it in the game the other night again. Sent Tommy Houck to the line, sent Tyree Samuel to the line. Those guys stepped up and made shots. Florida has missed the front end of the 1-1 some this season, and it's hurt them. That's when I would worry about it, right? You cannot miss front ends of 1-1s in the NCAA tournament. It's like a turnover. And so that's the kind of stuff that's costly. But my gut tells me, and maybe it's just optimism, but I think as the games get bigger and bigger, it's amazing how many times these kids manage to make their free throws. We saw with Johnny Broome in the SEC tournament shooting like 85% when he's a 60% free throw shooter. I think, some of it is as simple as what they do with Tyree Samuel, which is just remind him to slow down and take a deep breath.
So interesting that you mentioned Johnny Broome, because to me, one of the most impressive things anyone can do, coach, player, human being outside of sports, to me, the biggest and easiest sign of growth for anyone is to succeed where you've previously failed. And Johnny Broome, if listeners remember, was one of Florida's top portal targets in the front court. Todd Golden missed. Todd Golden had him, and he had Norchad Omier, who wound up going to Miami, at the top of his board, missed on both of them. Obviously, in the next cycle, he didn't miss. He got Tyree Samuel. That was a big time addition. Also got Micah Hanlogton from Marshall. So that to me is a big sign of Golden growing and learning and maturing and being better because of his past failures. That to me is one example of it. Mr. Blackmon, what examples aside from that have you seen of Golden that have made the Gators better in year 2 versus year 1?
That's a great question. I think for me, the top of the list is just last year. I don't think Florida had, I think Todd got away a little bit from what made his team successful at San Francisco, in what he kind of envisioned his teams would look like from his time with Randy Bennett at St. Mary's. I don't think Bruce Pearl has been as big an influence on him stylistically as he has been personally. And I think that's great because, it might be I'm sure because Bruce has never coached Florida and he's coached, opponents of Florida that have been thorns in Florida's side. There are Florida fans that don't like him as a person. He is a wonderful guy. And I can tell you that because I know him a little bit, and he's just done incredible stuff in the Auburn community. And, anyway, huge influence on Golden's life. I think in terms of basketball, like Todd just got back to what he wants to do, what he wants his identity to be, which is he wants his teams to rebound. And he wants to rely on guards that can create off the bounce. And so when he got in at Florida, I wouldn't say Kyle Lofton was a miss by any stretch of the imagination. Again, he was top 4 in the SEC in assist to turnover ratio, but he wasn't a guy that necessarily could create his own basket off the bounce. And he was an erratic shooter. So he went out and he fixed that by getting Zion Pullen, who's wonderful at creating off the bounce. They won a recruiting battle with Rick Pitino for Walter Clayton, which even with Florida's very good NIL basketball situation, much better than football, unfortunately or fortunately, whatever your view is on that, maybe a little of both. So in any event, they went out and got Walt, guy that can really shoot, a guy that is strong and can also create off the bounce because he's so explosive with his first step. So they went out and they got guys who could score in isolation when your offense breaks down. They didn't have those players a season ago. The one that they had really, well, they had two. They had Trey Bonham, who they didn't play very much because they started relying so much on the post game of Colin Castleton. And then they had Riley Kugel, who really didn't play till January. And Riley just, has lost his confidence offensively. And I think that there's also the meritocracy concept. Like, how are you practicing? That affects Riley Kugel right now. So that would be the biggest thing for me was like, what are your deficiencies as a coach? Well, he said, sometimes my offense breaks down. So he went out and got players that can compensate for that. And then he went out and got, things that help compensate for the deficiency and having a bunch of guards shoot all the time, which is missed shots. And he built a team that could really rebound and had a second effective bench player underneath. Now, to your point, he tried to get Colin Castleton help right out of the gate. I think that Joni Broom in particular was never going to come to Florida because Colin Castleton insisted. So Broom was the guy who wanted to go somewhere, start immediately, and that was that. I think Norchad Omier was the guy who took a big NIL package at Miami, and probably would have come to Florida but for that. It'll be interesting to see if Norchad hits the portal this spring.
Now that John Reese is broke, you mean?
Yeah, now that John Reese has no more money. We keep hearing about the Canes Collective being good. It probably is good for football. They don't have anywhere near the basketball NIL that Florida has. So it would be fascinating to see kind of what happens there. Or, there's other options too that could be discussed. The Boozer twins could reclassify. That would add somebody to the fold. We will see. But the point is, to me, it's just roster construction and just trusting like what he wants his program's identity to be. And instead of saying, hey, maybe this too big thing worked in the WCC, but it won't work in the Power Six, I better do it like everybody else. Todd said, wait a minute, why don't I just trust who I am? And that was always Billy Donovan's belief. It was always, I'm going to trust my own evaluations and my own process. And then acknowledging when he needed help, he goes out and gets Larry Shia to help defensively. I think Todd's teams are going to play better defense in the future. I think this team in particular was snake bit a little defensively by the departure of EJ Jarvis due to the medical stuff and just being unable to play anymore. But I think they will probably look at that. And again, my biggest praise for this staff is how process oriented they are and how they tend to mean what they say, which look, I know coaches want to say they mean what they say, but there's only a select handful that actually do.
Yeah, we noticed when our previous coach, there's a very unflattering nickname we have for him, and out of good faith, we'll let that be, not not go on our airwaves today. But there was a phrase he had: "Playing fast is in our DNA." Really, really. No,
Yeah.
like I feel like a lot of Gator fans have gotten numb to that. They're like, okay, great, Golden's okay. All right, Golden's is going to do what he's going to do because the last guy did. But no, he's not. He's different in that sense. He's obviously showing that.
Right.
Going and getting Tyree Samuel, going and getting EJ Jarvis. Now, I know he hasn't played, but still, that was a nice recruiting win for Florida. He is showing, and then what we see on the court, he is showing evidence of he means what he says. When he says he's going to do something, maybe it'll take a little bit longer than we would like, but he's going to do it. So one exception to that, though, or maybe he hasn't outright said this, but his Gators have problems against the zone for whatever reason that have lasted from the first game of the year against Loyola to the SEC tournament. Florida just, every now and then someone will get hot. Someone will occasionally, like here or there, pierce the zone, find a seam in it. But by and large, the Gators just don't score against the zone. So maybe this goes back to what you were saying about the free throws. The roster is what it is. But I feel like that's a little something that's more coachable and more fixable than the free throws because the guy's either going to hit them or they're not. But zone scoring against the zone is something that you can teach and you can coach. You as a basketball coach, particularly, do that all the time with your team. So what does Florida do in these few days between their last game against Auburn and their first game on Friday to, I don't know, maybe find a way to put more points on the board when teams go to zone? Because this is their last chance.
Yeah, no, I think Florida definitely has. I mean, the numbers are what the numbers are, and it's definitely a thing now. I'm on Florida Basketball Hour. We would wait like one game. We're like, okay, two games. By game three, we were like, oh, this is the thing. They really struggle to score against almost any type of zone defense, and I think that was concerning. Now, the one game where it became the most obvious to everyone, obviously, was at South Carolina, where the Gamecocks switched to the 1-3-1, and Florida, I think, had 8 turnovers against the zone in 25 possessions. They blew a 10-point or 11-point lead, and lost. What I will say about that game was that Florida came out of the first media timeout after the 1-3-1 and ran 2 beautiful actions to get 2 great shots. Will Richard I think he hit the backboard on one wide open 3, and not the rim. And then on the other one, Zion Pullen missed a layup, basically. So I think Florida showed that there was gonna be some, at least that they had written up an adjustment that might work. And then we saw it again in the conference tournament when Florida faced zone. They were pretty good against Texas A&M zone. They were not good against Georgia's zone, but they played a ton of zone possessions against Texas A&M, and part of that was during the 18-point comeback. So I think to some extent, they've done a little bit better. This one was just being more aggressive with ball movement. They didn't do anything that was schematically brilliant. They're still flashing a big to the high post. They're still hiding a shooter in the corner. That's what everybody's done for 40 years. I would like to see Florida go smaller against the zone defense. I think if Boise plays one, it would make sense to have Zion Pullen, the guy that is in the middle of it, because he's a great playmaker. And if you get him the ball in the mid-range, he's really lethal there. And I think Denzel Aberdeen has shown now that he can take care of the ball. So I think I would maybe consider having Aberdeen and Clayton out there. If they don't want to go that small, I would make sure that I had Condon out there, maybe instead of Tyrese Samuel, and put him in the middle of it because he could attack, or you could hide another big in the corner and have Condon shoot because he can hit the pick and pop. I don't want Tommy Houck taking threes against the zone. He's missed his last 12. They got to cut him off there until the offseason, in my opinion. But then it gets back to my statement about letting kids play with freedom and like he's allowed to shoot. I just don't want to see Tommy miss a second 3 in an NCAA tournament game.
Yeah.
Like if the first one is no, let's have that be that.
No,
We have to understand that Todd's going to give his guys freedom and appreciate that. We also don't have to.
There's got to be a line.
We also don't
drawn,
have
right?
to.
Like that's the thing. There you have
100%.
to.
Well,
Yeah.
well said. So I think Florida can make some more adjustments against the zone. I think you're absolutely right. I'd like to see Florida do that a little more effectively. Yeah, and here's the example. Florida played 28 possessions against zone against Georgia and was not particularly efficient. They scored 0.81 points per possession, which is pretty gross. But they played 16 possessions of zone against Texas A&M and scored at 1.01. So that's pretty good. So whatever they were doing against A&M, I think mainly was moving the ball faster. Of course, then they played 14 against Auburn and didn't do much at all. So, it seems like it's still a work in progress. And in March, if it's still a work in progress, then it's probably not getting fixed unless you try something different. And there's no harm in trying something different because if you lose, your season's over.
Right. So, I mean, if you're going to go down, you may as well go down swinging. You may as well go down trying something other than what got you the results that they got. I was surprised you didn't point to the game against LSU because that was the game to me that has that has me the most frightened. First, with LSU draining 11 threes. That's not good. Second, with the zone that Matt McMahon rolled out against Florida, which resulted in them scoring exactly 20 points over the final 14 and a half minutes. That's not good. So,
No.
which is what I go back to the point against Colorado. That's why I'm most scared against them, because they shoot the three at a much higher clip than LSU does. And that's what has me scared against any team that rolls out more than one zone look. Like if you start out with a 1-3-1 and Florida spends 20 minutes trying to score against it, and finally they pierce it with a couple of, I don't know, a couple open looks in seams in the zone, and then they immediately switch to maybe a 2-2-1. Well, Florida's going to spend another 20 minutes trying to figure that out. That's the game. You're done. You're cooked. So that to me is something Florida.
Here's one.
Go ahead. You're the guest. Go for it.
I was to say, here's one encouraging thing for you, because it would be pretty frightening. Colorado's played 30 possessions of zone defense all season. So
okay,
Chad Boyle is going to play man to man.
Okay, that is good to know. That is good. That is good to know. But then again, they have. Well, no, they won't, because they have to play that first round game against Boise State. I was gonna say they have a week to set it up and practice it, but no, they don't, because they have to play against Boise State. But I feel like that's something that helps me feel a little bit better. But still, if they were to roll it out and surprise Florida, the Gators would have no idea what to do, because they haven't, again, for most of the year. But all right, so that's Florida. We've talked about the Gators. We've talked about Boise State. We talked about Colorado. We talked about Marquette. We, I guess, in a cursory fashion, talked about Western Kentucky. Neil Blackmon, time to make some predictions for the Florida Gators. So first, who do you think they play in the first round?
So I think that right now Colorado's pretty hot, and in those first 4 games, I kind of think talent ends up winning out. And so, while I think Boise State can really guard and they can really rebound, and they shouldn't be in this game, and that's unfair, I feel like Colorado is the kind of team that for one game at least, their talent can kind of get them into the next round. So I'm picking Colorado over Boise State.
All right. Now let's make a prediction between Florida and Colorado.
Yeah, I think it's a break for Florida. They don't play the Broncos. I've said that pretty consistently. Speaking of teams that can play zone, Boise State's done it much more than Colorado. They played it on 103 possessions this year, which is a fair amount if you think about it.
Yeah.
They played it on 17 possessions in their impressive win over San Diego State in the conference tournament. So they could bust that out. I think there's a bunch of things they could do to stifle Florida. I think Florida would outscore Colorado, or will outscore Colorado. And I like the Gators to move on to the second round.
Okay. And you have as high a hit rate as anybody in college basketball, but let's just say, for argument's sake, you're wrong in this case, and it is Boise State who advances. Now it's Florida versus Boise State in the round of 64. What would your projection then be?
So mine in that one would be a narrow Boise State victory. I think that they do things that frustrate Florida, mainly, and I think they also negate Florida's biggest strength, which even without Micah Handlockton, is their ability to get second chance points. Boise just doesn't allow those. And, for all their difficulties offensively against good teams this year, Florida just doesn't guard that well. So I don't think Boise would have a terrible time scoring enough points to make this a close game. Boise's won 4 quad 1A games this year. As I've mentioned, they've beaten some very good basketball teams. I think Boise would move on if they played Florida.
All right, so now we're going to assume that we're going to revert back to your initial projection and say that because you do think Colorado beats Boise State, you do then think Florida beats Colorado. I'm going to assume you think Marquette moves on against Western Kentucky. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but am I correct in that?
Oh yeah, no, I think Marquette moves on regardless of where Tyler Krolik is at.
All right, fair enough. So now it's Florida versus Marquette. That would be what you have filled out in your brackets. We're going to help y'all at least fill out this one tiny portion of your bracket right here. Florida, Marquette in the round of 32. It's in Indianapolis, Florida. I don't think this is in the top 10 of issues, but it is something to point out, Gators don't travel well. It's something that they're as a fan base, we're just notoriously bad at. We just don't do it. So going to be a home game for Marquette. But again, as we pointed out, Marquette is far from perfect, and they do present a good matchup for Florida in that it is as good of a round of it is as favorable a round of 32 setup for Florida as you could possibly hope for, given that they're a 7 and their opponent would be a 2. So Florida, Marquette, who wins?
Yeah, I think the Gators would win this game. With a limited Tyler Kolek, I think he will be limited. He'd also be playing his second game in 3 days. With an oblique injury, I think Osea Gadaro gives Florida a lot of problems. But you mentioned it, Marquette does not rebound the ball particularly well. And even though they do produce a lot of steals, Florida has the guy who's the best in the country at point guard at limiting turnovers. And I think in just a small single game, Zion Pullen would get the job done. And I think Florida would win a narrow victory and move on to the Sweet 16.
All right. Fair enough. I will very quickly give mine. I actually think that Boise State gets the job done against Colorado. I think that their size and their ability to play defense will limit Colorado offensively. I think Boise State squeaks that out, even though Colorado does, as you mentioned, have more talent. So I think it's then going to be Florida and Boise State. I think Florida is going to have problems, as we mentioned, but again, for all we talk about Boise State's bigs, Omar Stanley, 6'8", 240, Tyson Degenhart, 6'8", 235. Neither of those guys is big as Tyree Samuel, who's at 6'10", 240. And neither is as tall as Alex Condon at 6'11". So obviously there's more to it than that. You have to get technical. You have to box out, of course. But from a pure number standpoint, Florida does have that advantage in the front court. So I think with all things considered, I think Florida squeaks it out against Boise State. Then against Marquette, as you mentioned, Tyler Kolek is not fully healthy. Osea Gadaro is also not fully healthy. He has a knee injury. So I think Florida would be able to squeak that one out as well and advance to the Sweet 16. We will not talk about anything further than that. We don't want to jinx it. We also would like to have you back if Florida does get to the Sweet 16 to talk about that potential regional matchup. But for now, that's all we've got. Neil Blackmon, thank you so much for your time. You're literally multitasking right now. You're doing lawyer stuff right now on late in the afternoon. But tell the listeners where they can find you. And I mean, we kind of already said it, but just remind everybody where we can read your work and where we can listen to your show.
Yeah, no, I'd love anybody to listen to Florida Basketball Hour with me and Eric Fawcett. Pretty much anywhere you stream. Follow me on Twitter at NW Blackmon. And yeah, you can read any number of my stories Saturday Down South. So definitely look forward to talking more hoops with you, Neil, and appreciate you having me.
Always appreciate your time, brother. Thank you so much. Go Gators.